Hello, my name's Hugh Dellar. I'm a teacher and tutor trainer based in London. And as of very recently, I'm the co-founder of Lexical Lab. I'm also the son of a mother who spent her entire career working in the kind of underfunded, failing state school systems that Schematas just been talking about. And as someone who's watched a parent kind of work in those systems and watched them slowly be dismantled and slowly be sold off, and state investment slowly cease to exist in all of those kinds of things. And given the fact that Schematas was doing a plenary which won't be subjected to the rigours of a Q&A, I do feel compelled to begin by telling you that the next 30 minutes won't be a continuation of the sort of neoliberal, wolf in sheep's clothing, capitalist takeover of the state system that I think we've all just witnessed. Having got that off my chest, I can probably begin. As you heard, my name's Hugh Dellar, and last year was actually my 20th anniversary of being a classroom teacher. So I decided it would be nice for this particular IATEFL to mark this sort of a milestone in life by reflecting back on what I've learned during these 2 decades in the classroom, and to somehow try and condense 20 years of, talk face sort of interaction into 20 little nuggets of hard-earned wisdom. 20 things that I've kind of come to believe about teaching, about learning, and about language. So, here goes. 20 things in 20 years, in 20 minutes. Whoosh, what was that? That was your life? Do I get another one? No, that was it. Anyway, like lots of native speakers, I kind of fell into teaching by accident when I was 24. And even to this day, I still get asked possibly the most infuriating question that an English language teacher can get asked by friends, which is, so, are you still teaching? And it's a question that really, really drives me mad, because I'd never dare ask my friends, are you still working as a doctor, or still doing the lawyer stuff, are you? Because the implication is that one day we're all going to grow up and get proper jobs. And the answer I always sort of give is, well, yes, I am teaching, because I really believe teaching is the best job in the world. And as I said, like most native speakers, I kind of fell into teaching by accident. And very quickly, I realised that I'd fell into a me-shaped hole. It was the first job I'd ever had where being me was actually not a complete disadvantage. And that where being me was something that could be turned to a sort of positive advantage. Very quickly in the classroom, I sensed this kind of arena of freedom, this space which offered creativity, this space which offered an opportunity to meet amazing people, this space which allowed you to start to kind of recreate the world in the classroom in the way in which you believed it ought to be. And a space which has allowed me to flourish and to develop and to be here at conferences like this. And I guess because we've all fallen into our own me-shaped holes as teachers, it's why I'm here and it's why you're here. In my very first class ever that I started teaching, I walked in on the first day and I had 7 Asian students and they were all from different countries. And this was fascinating for me. I'd never really met many Asian people, was really, really interested. I started teaching, I started talking. 15 minutes in, the door opened and there stood stereotypical Italian macho man. And he said, I'm Francesco Cilotto from Milano. And he looked around the room and then said, is all the Japanese. And immediately on the first day of my first kind of lesson, I realised I had a kind of problem. High stakes, what to do. And basically what I did is say, hello, come in, you're late, welcome. Not quite all Japanese. This is Chanaboom, he's from Thailand. This is Budi, he's from Indonesia, which isn't actually Japan. This is Tran Ang, he's from Vietnam, which also isn't actually technically Japan. Which part of Spain did you say you were from, Francesco? I am not from Spain, I am from... Oh, it's important to you where you're from, is it? Do you know what? That's funny, it's important for everyone else in the room. Come in, sit down. And I'm not quite sure how I knew how to do that, yeah? I guess we all develop conflict resolution mechanisms in our life away from the classroom. And it's obviously really important that we bring this kind of conflict resolution into the classroom and that we have strategies for doing this. My own kind of strategy that I've developed is this sort of firm, friendly, slightly sarcastic, hopefully slightly funny, possibly with a vague air of menace sort of way of trying to control these things in the classroom. You will develop your own ways of doing this kind of thing. And failure to do this often leads to kind of disaster, I think, because failure to tackle this kind of disruption leads to lessons slipping out of our control, factions developing in the classroom, outright mutiny, complaints, dismissal, end of career. So, one thing I've learned is to trouble trouble before trouble troubles you. Oh, wrong slide, look at that. Like most people, my own training on a CELTA course back in 1993 gave me a terrible dose of grammar anxiety, and most unpleasant it was too. I'm sure many of you have suffered equally from grammar anxiety, and it's a terribly contagious kind of disease. And what happened once I'd been infected with grammar anxiety on my CELTA course was I went into my own classrooms and started infecting my students with grammar anxiety. And collectively, we spent many fruitless hours fretting about the difference between the phone was ringing while I had a bath, the phone was ringing while I was having a bath, the phone rang while I had a bath, the phone was ringing while I was having a bath, only John spoke to Mary, John only spoke to Mary. What are the semantic differences between these fascinating grammatical sentences? And one day I was doing one of these exercises when another Italian student I was teaching called Luigi said, I understand, grammar is choice, I get it, but which one is most useful? Which would you say? And at this very moment, I was suddenly cured of my grammar anxiety because I realised the only honest answer I could give Luigi was, to be honest, none. I've never said any, you're never going to say any, you're never going to hear anybody say any, and really, we should probably move on from pondering anxiously over bizarre grammatical sentences that none of us are ever going to use. And henceforth, after this, I vowed to teach nothing that I would never say and never hear said. And do you know what? As a result, I feel less soiled. I feel far happier in my teaching. And I know from my own experience of being in the classroom that my students use language better. The way that I was taught to think about language was based on a fundamental lie. And it's a lie, I think, that's propagated by the vast majority of teacher training courses and the vast majority of mainstream course books. And the lie is, and maybe some of you believe it, but the lie is that what makes learning better is fundamentally to do with the study of discrete structures. Or more generally, the lie is that grammar is somehow at the heart of what language is. It's clearly not. And this lie is limiting, I think. This lie results in poor teaching and poor learning, and it cripples us as teachers in terms of our understanding of how language really works. In reality, as Michael Hoey pointed out far more eloquently than I could ever do yesterday, accuracy emerges slowly. Accuracy is to do with repeated exposure to commonly used patterns in the language. Accuracy develops out of the priming that we receive. And I think if Michael Hoey is right, and I think he is, we really have to start taking this on board, and we really have to start abandoning this sort of fundamental lie at the heart of what we do as teachers. Haven't started yet. Number 4, I think training novice teachers to give students lists of a few random topics and some grammar structures and maybe the lists of different skill areas, and then asking the students to self-diagnose their own ailments on most general English courses is fundamentally a mad activity. Because most students basically don't know what they need. Most students will tell you what they need is more grammar. And even the ones who don't make mistakes, even the ones who are kind of proficiency level, will still tell you, I know words, I need grammar. And this is because they've all been infected with grammar anxiety. And I'd suggest that if you really want to do a needs analysis, fine. Here's what your general English students need. They need repeated exposure to the most frequent words in context. They need a better understanding of how those most frequent words work with other words and how those most frequent words work with grammar. They need advice on how best to go about learning all of this stuff. They need to listen to and read a wide range of graded texts. They need a chance to discuss their opinions and to discuss their ideas. They need to be listened to, they need to be reformulated, they need to be scaffolded, they need to be shown better ways of how to do what they want to do. Students given a needs analysis form will never tell you this. And perhaps it's time we just stopped wasting the first couple of lessons on this kind of thing in general English classes. Phew. Students, I think, often enter the English language classroom expecting English to work in the same way as their own first languages. And as a result, they try to impose their own pre-programmed, pre-primed logic onto English. And as teachers, we hear it all the time. Just last week in my class back in London, one of my students said, "Football pitch? Seriously, you call it a football pitch? Not football field?" It's a pitch. "But the position is midfield. He plays in the middle of the field." "Yeah, no, actually, midfielders play in the middle of the pitch." "This is so stupid. In my language, we have one word for this." So yes, I don't know if you've noticed, the languages are actually different. That's why you're here in the classroom. And I think often with students, the stronger the resistance, the less the learning. And one of the jobs that I've come to realise we have in the classroom is to smooth this lurching uphill journey towards submission to a kind of unintelligible logic and submission to a different way of framing the world through language. And the way we do it is we kind of oil these waters with more noticing, with more smiling, and with more saying, "Yes, I know, it's different. Ha, crazy English, eh? Who knows why it's like this? Still, it keeps me in a job." And then to move swiftly on. Because ultimately, from a student's point of view, resistance is futile. When I was trained to be a teacher 20 years ago, I was sort of trained to have a deep fear of the dreaded teacher talking time. This was drilled into me on my CELTA, and I was trained to be a very output-focused teacher. Ultimately, when I first started teaching, it didn't really matter to me what kind of nonsense my students ended up talking about in the classroom, so long as I could keep them talking. And this led to many strange hours where students would be working in pairs and debating the relative merits of why pizza is better than Paris, or why Paris might be better than pizza. We worked through the whole of the Clipple Keep Talking book. I felt I was a really student-centred teacher. Until eventually, about 8 or 9 years into my career, it finally dawned on me that students don't actually learn by sitting there, chatting away in the classroom, using the language that they already came to class with, no matter how much fun they're having. Actually, we learn language from language, and we need to learn huge amounts of it, which means we need huge amounts of input. And given this, I've sort of reversed the way I think about what the function of the classroom is. And I've now come to believe that input is far more crucial in the classroom than output is. And I think if we're realistic, even in this modern day and age with computers and technology and all of these things, if the students are not getting the guided, graded, scaffolded input in the classroom, can we be certain we know where they are getting it from? And I think we need to be, semi-real about that. The flipped classroom, or homework as we used to call it, it's predicated on the assumption that our students really are going away and doing all of this. And those of us who've been setting homework for the last 20 years know that just because it's on a computer and you get little carrots every time you kind of win a point or something, it really doesn't mean your students are going to necessarily do any more homework than they ever used to. And if you believe this, I think, the implication is that the materials themselves need to provide more input, and we need to provide more input to ensure that our students have the opportunity to learn language from language. Early on in my career, like many teachers, I think, I had an insatiable thirst for recipes. I couldn't go to a conference or a session without feeling I had to get something to come away with that I could do on a Monday morning. I saw my own development as a teacher in terms of broadening my repertoire as tricks and developing all these kind of innovative, fun, creative ways of doing things in the classroom. And actually, despite having written a series of course books called Innovations, I would suggest there's actually too much innovation and creativity in ELT. And that actually it often results much more in the kind of innovative inventions you can see in this particular demented image than it does in anything really useful. And I think we've come to a stage in English language teaching, reflected at things like IATEFL, where method is wrongly valued over language knowledge and language awareness. You look at the sessions over the last 4 days, how many of the ones you've seen have been about language, and how many of the ones you've seen have been about methodology? I think we have this balance very wrongly skewed. And I've come to believe as a teacher that unless what we're doing is rooted in a solid theoretical view of language and learning, any innovation we might engage in is ultimately pointless. My own beliefs have sort of led me away from innovation and recipe to just basic, simple principles that inform what I do on a day-to-day basis, where essentially I'm trying to ensure students meet useful language, help them to grasp it, help them to notice aspects of it, get them to practice it, get them to revise it, and repeat. Life used to be easy. When I was younger, I used to believe that most errors that students made were grammatical, and that these would be easily corrected. It actually took me ages to realise that the tasks I was doing, which were often tasks designed to practice the discrete production of 1 or 2 grammatical structures, were actually the reason why my students were producing simple grammatical errors, that the tasks themselves forced the output, which forced the errors. And it took me a similarly sort of long period of time to realise that broader, freer tasks result in a much wider range of linguistic problems. Sadly, I think, though, as teachers, we still fall back on what we've been primed to notice through our own teacher development and education, which is grammar, because of the awful, contagious nature of grammar anxiety. But actually, if you really start looking at student output and student production in freer kinds of contexts, the truth is much more complicated. Often, meanings have been semi-digested, but the students don't really have a sense of the context. Meanings have been expressed, but they've been expressed clumsily. Meanings have sort of been expressed, but students are bringing over from their own first language the way they feel those words should be using. And working out how to correct those kinds of things is much more complicated than underlining a present perfect mistake and putting GR above it in red letters. And actually much more to do with repriming and reconditioning the student's experience of how language operates. Halfway there, hang in. I think pronunciation is one of the great neglected areas of language teaching. And where it is present in the classroom, it's often focused on little discrete phonemes, as you saw in this thing Sugata was doing with a sheep kind of thing. I think there's a reason why we often neglect pronunciation, because obviously after a certain formative point, time that we spend on pronunciation in the classroom reaps very limited kind of reward, especially when compared to time spent studying Lexis or whatever. There are reasons for this. Being able to pronounce a foreign language, it's a motor skill. It needs drilling into the muscle memory, the same way as playing a guitar or something does. And there's only so much of that drilling we can do in the classroom. Accents seem to fix fairly early on. There's lots of L1 phonological priming, which impacts upon the way we can pronounce second languages. There's the whole ELF debate. You know, it doesn't matter if you can't say 3 and 3. The Irish don't. Why bother? And actually, I think the real reason we need to bother is because the goal of doing pronunciation in class is not to improve students' pronunciation. It's to improve students' ability to hear and to improve students' listening. And when we're drilling, and we're drilling chunks, like, it was a bit of a nightmare. Everyone, it was a bit of a nightmare. How long have you been here? How long have you been here? What we're actually doing is we're developing students' awareness of what Richard Caldwell, I don't know if any of you have seen his talk. If not, please try and track it down if it's online, because it was remarkable. What Richard Caldwell has called the jungle of spoken language, where you have weak forms, squeezed zones, dead consonants, all these kinds of things that Richard describes in his sort of amazing book, Phonology for Listening. It never ceases to amaze and depress me to see quite how many sessions on NLP, on learning styles, on brain-based learning, and all of this kind of thing IATEFL continues to accept. Let's be clear about this, and I urge you to watch Russell Main's video online. He carried out a very cold, forensic, scientific dissection of all of this. These ideas are pseudoscience. These ideas are based on neuromyths, and they hold no reality. With the whole learning styles argument, actually, the hard science shows us, A, it depends what we're learning. Learning to play football, you tend to do it quite kinesthetically. Learning to play music, do you know what? You use the oral part of your brain. Who would have thought it? And actually, the other thing the science shows is generally everything's basically interconnected. Multiple intelligence theory, it's been completely scientifically discredited. Intelligence actually stems from the frontal cortex, and we apply this intelligence across a whole range of different kinds of competencies. And I would urge IATEFL and the organisers just to stand up henceforth to pseudoscience, and I would encourage us to ditch the gobbledygook from our profession. As teachers, thank you. I'll be here for the next 15 minutes. As teachers, I think, we all love to make our own material. I drifted into becoming a materials writer as a result of someone who made their own kinds of lessons. We all love to craft our own material, craft our own kind of lessons. It took me a long time personally to realise that 100 one-hour lessons do not a 100-hour course make. Because a course is different from a kind of randomly accumulated series of lessons. A course needs to be tightly woven. It needs balance of content, balance of input. Possibly it needs a balance of more social language, more academic language, more professional language. It needs a balance of light and shade. It needs a balance of activity and task types. It needs inbuilt recycling of language. It needs inbuilt pre-cycling of language. And none of this happens without conscious thought and a lot of conscious planning in advance of the delivery of a course. And if we're somehow to kind of create an umbrella across lessons, or a thread which weaves through lessons, then there needs to be some kind of theoretical and conceptual framework which facilitates this kind of interweaving. I'm a football fan, and possibly I suspect, unlike Sugata, I'm also a socialist. And I believe in the team, and I believe that the individual is ultimately secondary to the collective. And just as often you get football teams built around very, very strong units, such as the tedious but victorious Greek Euro 2004 winners a few years ago. Just as often you get this, and these teams can beat teams full of flamboyant individualists. I think there's a kind of parallel between this and the classroom. We live in a sort of age where there's a lot of discourse about self and focus on the individual learners. The Oxford Dictionary word of the year is selfie. You know, it's a very kind of narcissistic, individualistic time. But actually, from a teaching point of view, the dynamic of the group is much more crucial than the individuals in it. And as teachers, one of our jobs is to meld disparate individuals into one unit where all of the members value each other equally, and they all realise that their own development and progress is tied in to that of every other person in the group. And I guess our job in this situation is to emphasise commonality over difference, and our failure to do this results in a kind of catastrophic teaching failure on occasion. The myth of the difficulty of teaching phrasal verbs has long been a pet hate of mine. Phrasal verbs are so badly taught, it pains me. Either, I think, we're encouraged to go into a classroom and say, okay, today we're going to learn get on with, get over, get into, get out of, get away from, and get, whatever another preposition might be. Or we somehow turn phrasal verbs into some sort of grammar nightmare where students are forced to fret about transitive and intransitive verbs and juggle prepositions. And I would just ask, please, can we stop this nonsense? Which part of words go with other words and with grammar do we not understand? There's no difference in terms of ease or difficulty of learning from trying to teach someone to say, I need to cut down on my drinking, a sentence I've found myself in use of over the last couple of days. And it's no harder or easier to teach than teaching, he's always trying to undermine me. So long as what we're doing is going into the classroom and basically saying, these words go together, in this order, learn them. Like most of you, thank you, I was trained to talk the skills talk and to walk the skills walk. I used to activate schematas in my classroom. I used to get my students to skim and scan. They'd be busy predicting and guessing from context. And like most of you in this room, I suspect, I used to think I was teaching skills in these lessons. Actually, I was teaching nothing. Good readers and good listeners do not have better skills. They have better language. The skills do not exist outside of language and outside of context. They're non-transferable, they're non-context independent. You want your students really to read better and to listen better, the first and primary thing you need to do, teach them more language. As a teacher trainer now, I've come to believe that the main aim of any lesson, which is based on a reading text or based on a listening text, should always be to use the text first and foremost as a vehicle for new language, and to use the text as a prompt for further discussion. I came off my CELTA course very much focused on pair work for multilingual students. And after about 6 months of teaching in the UK, I found myself working in Indonesia, teaching 60 or 70 teenage kids in a huge room with a microphone and a really scratchy, dusty old blackboard, in a room where power cuts frequently happened and the lights would go out and we had to teach by candles in 36 degrees. Much of this conference, and I think quite rightly, it's not a criticism of the conference, much of this conference has been about the dash to digital. And again, you know, Schematas very much part of that kind of dash to digital. But still, we need to remind ourselves, and it's a great thing coming here where you get to talk to people who are working in contexts like the British Council Cardboard, this kind of thing. 63% of the world does not yet have access to the internet, okay? Yet, in all of these places, teachers teach and learners learn. And we would do well to remember this, I think. And if we're really serious about professional development and professional engagement, we need to be engaging with the profession as a whole, not just the part of the profession which most resembles ourselves. This requires us to understand where all of our overseas colleagues are currently at. And I think if we fail to recognise this, it sort of means an inability to work together, to move towards the next point down the teacher development line. That old retro-futurist kind of notion that many of us my age grew up with, which told us that technology would liberate us in the future into a life of massively increased leisure time, turned out really to be a bit of a lie, didn't it, actually? Because we all wake up, first thing we do, check Facebook, come to a conference talk, sit there on our mobile phones, tweeting away. We try and write conference talks, we vanish for days down online rabbit holes whilst we're trying to work. And as teachers, of course, all of this impacts upon us. We're bombarded constantly, usually by strange odd numbers I've noticed. 17 apps that your learners must use. 39 ways to use a YouTube clip. Don't get me wrong, I'm really not anti-technology, far from it. I'm very, very interested in the whole kind of ed-tech debate. But my God, it takes time, okay? And I think as teachers, the first thing to say is we need to push for this time that it takes to be paid time. Yeah? If schools really want us to kind of tech up and get to grips with educational technology, pay us. You know, we're not supposed to be doing this as sort of all of our weekends overtime. See, that one struck a chord with some of you. Okay? And, you know, I think we also need to realise that ultimately... what am I doing? Ultimately, really what the internet provides is stuff, okay? It's a sort of infinite amount of stuff. And unless we're filtering this through some kind of keen pedagogical principles, all we're doing is giving people access to infinite stuff. And I would suggest we can do better than this. Too much time for too many of us, I think, in terms of our teacher development, is spent online. And a lot of this time is spent in the closed, self-reflecting echo chambers of social media. Any of you have seen that new Spike Jonze film? She or her? I can never remember which one it's called. Her. You know, it's that. The technology comes to replicate us and we create the technology that echoes back our own sense of ourselves. And As we're doing this, and I do it myself, as we're doing this, it reduces the time we have available for serious study and for deep engagement with the greats of the field. I've learned myself pretty much all of what I've come to know from reading and listening to and immersing myself in the work of the greats of ELT. They've shaped my whole outlook on language, my whole outlook on the way learning works, and whatever small value I've been able to add myself to the whole field has very much been built by standing on the shoulder of giants. Strangely, the ones who've impacted upon me most all just happened to have been called Michael. Michael Swan, Mike McCarthy, Michael Lewis and Michael Hoey. And I guess one of the things that I've kind of come to realise, and that again I would urge, is make time to read. Read properly. Read books. Don't just read blogs and tweets and Facebook. Obviously, you don't have to just read books by Michaels, although I would suggest they're a good place to start. And maybe, if we do have any Michaels in the audience, the time to step up to the plate has come. British ELT, I think, under the looming influence of our hippie forefathers, loves this idea of teaching as some kind of art. Teaching as a space for creativity, drama, magic, bad music, and even worse, poetry. In other kind of teaching contexts, teaching is viewed as a science. Teaching is viewed as something which can be broken down to a kind of an adaptive learning mentality, if you like, to a number of words to be taught, multiplied by a number of generative structures, with X amount of controlled practice thrown in, equals guaranteed success in 3 months for your children for only $399. Both models are clearly wrong, okay? Teaching, I would suggest, is actually a craft. I recently learned a lovely Japanese word, a Japanese concept called shokunin, okay? And shokunin basically kind of means a master. And it's applied in Japanese to anyone doing any kind of handicraft. So you can be a sushi shokunin, or you can be a calligraphy shokunin. And I would suggest you can also be a teaching shokunin. And what it implies is a level of artistry and a level of wisdom and a level of skill which is acquired by essentially repeating the same tasks over and over again and reflecting on how you've performed those kind of tasks until some sort of almost but possibly never quite attainable perfection is attained. Now, to me, that seems like something to aspire to. Finally, and again, it's quite timely to be doing this in this grand room after the talk we witnessed before this, a sobering thought in an age of austerity. Lots of things are getting tough in EFL, I think. And, there's obviously lots of opportunities, but things are getting tough. One thing is the kind of independent publishers that I was able to enter the whole kind of English language writing industry through are basically disappearing. The little indie publishers have all been swallowed up by the majors. Generally, corporate companies are all predicated on quarterly profits. They're less keen to take risks than maybe the little LTPs or summer towns or, the kind of cottage industry publishers of the past used to be. As many of you will know, there's a bloodbath going on in the publishing industry. As a result, it's harder than ever, I think, to break into mainstream ELT publishing as a writer. If you do manage to, as again many of you will know, it's harder than ever to make a living. Fees are the new royalties, and that's fine, but that's kind of making it harder for people to get into that kind of thing as a full-time kind of living career. As you also saw in the talk before me, there's incredible threats to the status of teachers all around us. We're being sold MOOCs, adaptive learning, online snake oil salesmen, we're being sold hole in the walls, and our status and our value as, what was her name, the efficiency of inefficiency woman? Kathleen Grays, was it? The plenary a couple of days ago. As she was saying, a lot of what we have to offer isn't measurable in any of those kind of contexts. And obviously the internet may provide opportunities, but even the internet isn't a level playing field. The big boys are in there first. They've got the plate. They've got the cash to occupy a lot of the bandwidth that's out there for all of us. So times are tough, and times are getting tougher, and time's almost up, I've just been told. So ultimately, what I'd like to kind of leave you with, to all go away with from the conference, is the fact that really none of this matters, because as teachers in this room, we know we have the best job in the world. Thank you.